if you were a kid growing up in the 90s, there's a pretty good chance that you wanted to be like Mike. And of course, who I'm talking about is Michael Jordan, the best basketball player to have ever played the game. There's some other guy named LeBron, but he's not nearly as good as Michael Jordan. And any sane historian of basketball history would know that. So that's a veiled shot at some other people, staff on the other campus. An example of this idea of wanting to be like Mike. When I was in high school, I played on the high school basketball team, and then we had a guy on our team who loved Michael Jordan. And so he imitated Michael Jordan in every possible way, shape, and form. He tried to walk like Michael Jordan walked. You know, Michael had that kind of certain walk, a little swagger, and he would literally walk into school that way. He would walk to the gym that way. He would walk everywhere that way. He would do other things like Mike wherever he could. You know, he had the number 23 Bulls jersey, all that kind of stuff. And on the basketball team, whenever he drove to the basket, you know what I'm about to say, if you guys have any familiarity with Michael Jordan, when he drove to the basket, he would stick out his tongue. Because Michael Jordan, anytime he drove to the basket, stuck out his tongue. And so this guy would stick out his tongue anytime he drove to the basket. Now, you know that he's trying to imitate somebody because that does not help you drive any quicker, or it doesn't help you with your ability to put the ball in the basket, to put your tongue out. It's just a thing you're imitating. And so this guy did that on our basketball team. This is what it reminds me of. When you imitate someone, really the bottom line is, as you try to imitate someone, you are really following that person. That's really what you're doing. And so whether that's your kids with you or somebody else with a basketball player or a football player, or whatever it is, you really are in essence simply following that person. It's interesting that in the modern social media platform called Instagram, when people get connected with you, they become what? Your followers, right? And so the question people ask is, how many followers do you have on Instagram? I actually forgot about this, but you can actually buy followers, I think, on Instagram as well. So you can just buy your way to followers, and it's a thing that you can do. And I think about this, and I think about it's not unusual that we pursue followers, because really we as people are hardwired to follow. And even the people here in this room who, like, you know, they're on their own path, they would say. Like, they don't follow anybody at all. They're doing their own thing. But the reality is they're actually probably following somebody else who said they were on their own path, doing their own thing. Like, we can't help but not follow people. It's a thing that we do. It's totally in our nature. And as we're going to find out this morning, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just depends on who we are following. And so I want to take you to Matthew again, Matthew chapter 4 this morning. If you have a Bible, Matthew 4, 18 to 22, as we continue our teaching series called The Kingdom is Near. This morning we are really going to drill down and see that the kingdom is near as we follow Jesus and help others as well come to follow Jesus. Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 to 22. This short passage, I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to kind of go verse by verse down through it. Here's what the text says. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once, they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Now, we're going to see some specific teaching points this morning about following Jesus that I hope will be helpful to us as we seek to follow him in our own lives. The first point that immediately becomes very clear in verses 19 and 21 is that Jesus is intentionally pursuing people to follow him. It is not an accident that you and I are here this morning seeking to follow Jesus, that Jesus is actually intentionally seeking people to follow him. And he does it right here in the text with these two sets of brothers, Simon, who's Peter, and Andrew, and then James and John. We see it coming right off the page. Let's go back to verse 18. He calls Simon Peter and Andrew his brother. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, the text says, he sees the two brothers. They're casting a net into the lake, and were obviously because they were fishermen. And Jesus comes to them in verse 19, and he says, "Come, follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people." This is Jesus intentionally pursuing people to follow him. Now, in Matthew's account and in Mark's account, there are four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Matthew and Mark record this story, and they record it in very short form like what we see here. However, in Luke, he also records this, but he gives us a little bit more information that provides some significant insight into how Jesus is pursuing these four guys. Just before he calls them, in Luke's account, he got into one of the fishing boats. Now, Luke says the reason that he got in the fishing boat was because there's a bunch of people that wanted to hear Jesus teach. And there were so many of them, they're crowding in, and so Jesus jumps into the boat at the edge of the lake so that he can teach. And so he teaches. After Jesus teaches the people, he turns to Simon, and he tells him to head out to deeper waters and let down their nets. All right, now it's kind of like the incomplete picture here, but Simon doesn't love Jesus' request initially, mainly because they had been fishing all day. If you're a professional fisherman and you've been fishing all day and you haven't caught anything, and this teacher comes along, jumps in your boat, is teaching in your boat, and at the end of his teaching, he's like, "Hey, let's go out and we're going to go out in the deeper waters with the information. We're going to go catch some fish." You're kind of like, "Hey, dude, like I'm kind of the expert here, not you. Like we're not going to catch any fish if I didn't catch any all day." But for some reason, Simon agrees, just because Jesus had told him to do it, so he did it. So Simon and Andrew go out into the deeper waters, and the text says that they catch so many fish that their nets were breaking. And it got to the point that they signaled James and John to come over with their boat and help. And then there were still so many fish that both of the boats were in danger of sinking. And so this is what's happening before these people actually follow Jesus. Luke records what happens next after their boats are the way they are, the fish are all everywhere. In Luke chapter 5, verse 8, when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of the fish that they had taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." And so they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. And what you need to see from that is that in that moment, Simon and Andrew experienced Jesus for the first time. They experienced somebody they have never experienced before. It was so radically life-altering that they grabbed all those fish, pulled them all to shore, and said, "We're done. And we're going to follow this guy who said, 'Come follow me.'" And Jesus is pursuing them to follow him. He does the same thing with James and John back in Matthew chapter 4, verse 21. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. And they were in a boat with their father Zebedee preparing their nets. And Jesus called them as well. What we need to see in these two specific situations is the intentionality of Jesus. Not only for them, but for us as well. And I want to point this out because I think at times we allow our presence in the presence of Jesus to be somewhat casual, to make the link there somewhat coincidental. When in fact, what's going on in this moment is that Jesus is pursuing you and Jesus is pursuing me in significant ways. Scotty Smith, in talking about the intentionality of Jesus, says this: we are called to belong, not merely invited, but subpoenaed into an eternal life of being wanted, desired, known, loved, celebrated, and enjoyed. This is the Jesus that is pursuing us. He's pursuing us for our joy, for the good things that will happen in our lives, to be known, to be wanted, desired, loved, celebrated, and enjoyed in a way where God is still the central being. This is the pursuit by Jesus of us. And this is exactly what James and John and Simon and Andrew are at the beginning of experiencing in their lives in this moment. Following Jesus is a great thing for us. Now, we see a second teaching point that emerges from the text in verse 19 in the statement that Jesus makes to Simon and Andrew in verse 19. Following Jesus involves using your God-given gifts, talents, abilities, and experiences to help other people experience Jesus. Now, notice what Jesus says when he calls them in verse 19. He says, "Come, follow me." Now, that's straightforward. But then he says, "And I will send you out to fish for people." That statement's a really interesting statement. And it's meant to show us that God is going to use the background and the experience of those individuals, and he's going to use them instead of just making money, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. He's going to then take that and use that to help people come into the kingdom. Jesus calls them to fish, but for different fish. And this experience they gained from fishing would now be used to help people come into the kingdom, to draw the kingdom near. And so that makes me ask a question this morning of us in the room here. What gifts, talents, abilities, experiences do we have that God can use to help bring other people into the kingdom? Now, I know for a fact that many of you here this morning are already using your gifts and talents and abilities in that way. And I've seen that, and I love that, and I appreciate that. And God's doing a great thing in your life. And so I encourage you, if that's where you are this morning, I just continue to keep pressing forward, to keep moving on in that way. And you might want to ask yourself, what's the next step in this process? Where do I go next? What does this look like? Lord, how can I continue to use my gifts and abilities to further your kingdom? If you're here this morning and you would say, you know what, I'm not sure that I am using these talents and abilities and experiences in the ways that I think I could, you might want to ask yourself, what do you think could be your first step in this process? Now, we as a church, we have a next steps area that's out in the lobby that you can come and hang out afterwards, and you can actually have a conversation with somebody, and that may be your next step in trying to figure out what your next step is. But there also could be things that would help you maybe with things like maybe serving here at the church at Hebron, and maybe you serve in kids or kids junior and first impressions, or in a number of different ways. But the way that you could use your gifts and talents and experiences could also be outside the context of the church at Hebron to help people be introduced to the kingdom. And so I encourage you to really think long and hard about how God could use you, and really pray and ask the Lord, hey, Lord, what would that look like for me to be used? And I would say some of you in the room this morning feel maybe like you can't be used, like that you don't have any talents to give. And I just want to say that is not something, that thought, while very understandable, isn't necessarily a thought that's helpful. Because one, it's not true, and two, God has wired you specifically to be helpful in bringing people to the kingdom. You just have to kind of figure out how that fits. A kingdom mindset is always looking to bring more people into the kingdom. A kingdom mindset is always looking to help people experience Jesus. And I'll say this in a moment, that just so it's clear, I think maybe we understand this, but sometimes when you assume things, you don't always assume right. So when I say a kingdom mindset, what I don't mean is like try to bring everybody here to the Church of Hebron. We would love for as many people as possible to come here and experience Jesus through the Church of Hebron. But if we, in our interactions with other people, bring people into the kingdom and they end up going to Lakeside, that's awesome. That is great. There's not a downside to that. If they go to Hebron Baptist Church, that's not a downside. If they go to First Church, that's not bad. We're trying to help people come to the kingdom. And wherever they can go, that they can get connected with a Bible teaching and Bible preaching church, that's awesome. We would love them to come here. But it's not a loss when other churches that are preaching and teaching the Bible see people come to believe in Jesus and get plugged in there. That's a gain. And so that's a kingdom mindset. The kingdom is never nearer than when people are drawing near to Jesus. And we're seeing that here unfold in the text this morning. Now, there's a third teaching point that I see in the text that I think is important for us to see. Following Jesus is a choice that we make, and it has some urgency to it. I want you to see the way that they respond to Jesus' call. Verse 20, at once they left their nets and followed him. You could say that Simon and Andrew were impulsive people and they left their nets because they're impulsive people. And I maybe Simon certainly seems to have some impulsiveness in him. As we see him later in Peter, he does some really very impulsive things. But as we saw from Luke, what happened here is that they got to hear Jesus and they got to hear Jesus teaching and they got to see Jesus work miracles, and their decision to follow Jesus has the solid foundation of their firsthand experience of Jesus. It wasn't that they were just impulsive and they just happened to follow somebody. They didn't walk by someone and go, oh, hey, look, let me try that religion out today. That wasn't at all what happened. It was the radical nature of experiencing firsthand who Jesus was. When they saw who Jesus was, when they heard him talk, when they saw him do the miracles, they're like, this guy is different than everybody else. And because this guy is different, we're dropping everything and we're going to follow him. And that's kind of the impact of Jesus. The kingdom is filled with people who would never have believed that they would be following Jesus the way they are now. Like if we interviewed everybody in the room this morning, there would be people that would be like, yeah, 20 years ago, there's no chance. There's no chance that I would have said I would be a follower of Jesus. And yet here you are. And how would we explain that? We would simply explain that as that we have encountered a Jesus like James and John, like Simon and Andrew did, who just cannot be turned away from. And by the way, in this moment, the four people here, and as well as I would say probably most of you as well, you wouldn't change a thing if you had it to do over again either. Now let's go back to Matthew 5:8. Notice how Peter responds in this moment to Jesus before he follows. It's interesting. He says, the text says he fell at his knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." Did you catch that? I think it's fascinating to me. James and John also immediately follow in verse 22. It says, and immediately they left their boat and their father, and they followed him. In Luke, we see that they left the hired help as well with their dad and went and followed him. Peter in this moment, as he follows Jesus, he saw his sinfulness and when he was comparing himself against Jesus' sinlessness. Peter's darkness was apparent when he saw the light of Jesus. And what you see here is Peter's response when he sees Jesus initially isn't to follow him, right? You see that in the text, that it's initially not to follow, it's actually to draw away. He's like, Lord, you have got to go away from me. I am a sinful person. Ultimately, he ends up running to Jesus and not away from him. And I would argue that as we are rolling through the Gospels, we are seeing this pattern throughout the book of Matthew, that people are running to Jesus and not away from him, even though they know their sinfulness. When people see their sin and they want change, they find hope in Jesus, and they run to him and not away from him. And we are seeing here that Jesus is also running toward them in their sin. Now, there's a fourth teaching point in the text that I think is important for us to see, and it shows up in verses 20 and 22. Following Jesus is a costly choice that you won't regret. And now, when I say that, I understand that when I say it's a costly choice, a lot of us are like immediately like, okay, costly choice, I'm going to regret this, right? Because who hasn't regretted spending a lot of money on something? Maybe this week, I don't know. It depends on where these things can go. It usually is like a car or some type of investment or something where it's costly and then we immediately regret it. But following Jesus is one of these things where it's costly, but we never regret it. It's still the best decision that we've ever made. In Luke 5, it says, verse 11, so they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed Jesus. It's interesting. They pull their nets out of the water after catching all the fish. A successful day. A very successful day after a not successful day. Does that make sense? Like they were successful not at all, and then all of a sudden they were very successful. And as soon as they got everything up, they immediately left that. They left their careers that they knew to follow Jesus. It cost them to follow Jesus. They left that behind. Now, many people today can follow Jesus and not leave their current careers. In fact, for the majority of us here this morning, to follow Jesus means to follow Jesus in our careers. It would not be true, though, of these four individuals. Simon and Andrew had to leave their lives as fishermen. So did James and John. James and John says back in the text of Matthew chapter 4, they were in a boat with their father Zebedee preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. They left the family business to follow Jesus. And the thing is that what you see from Luke's account, which is the expanded account, is that Jesus doesn't promise them anything other than that he's going to make them fish for people. That's the only thing that he promises, that I'm going to help you fish for people. But outside of that, there's no 5-year plan here. There's no 10-year plan here. There's no benefit package. There's nothing. There's no car. There's no I just lost the name for that. When you get like a membership to a golf course, what's that? It's a membership. It's a golf membership. Whatever. It wasn't in my notes. I would really like a golf membership at some point in my life, but a country club membership. That's what I'm trying to get at. Sometimes communication's hard. None of that, right? None of that was there for them at all. Instead, all Jesus says is, follow me. And what do they do? What do they do in that moment? They drop their nets and follow Jesus. They didn't follow Jesus because they didn't have anything going on worth pursuing in their lives, but because following Jesus is simply better than anything else they had going on. And so I want to talk to you, if you're here this morning and you're not yet a follower of Jesus, and maybe you come to the church at Hebron regularly, but you kind of haven't stepped over that faith line yet. I'm really glad you're here, and we hope that you feel welcomed and loved and that you can hang out here as long as you would like. We would love for you to stay here forever. It'd be great. But I just want to point out something to you, that the other people in the room here who are followers of Jesus are not followers of Jesus simply because they don't have anything better going on in life. It's just that Jesus is so much better than anything they have going on in life. And the reality is Jesus is better than anything you have going on in life. You just don't know it. See, what if they are following Jesus because Jesus is simply better? And what if you are not following Jesus because you haven't realized how much better Jesus is than whatever else you have going on? What if it's not the people in the room who are lacking the context, misunderstanding, misreading the situation, but what if you are? And Jesus is ultimately better than whatever it is you're holding on to. Simon and Andrew and James and John heard Jesus teach. They watched Jesus work, and everything in their lives just faded to the background against the opportunity to follow him. And to those who here this morning, as you read this passage and you see this passage, I think there's an additional challenge that goes right directly to our hearts. And I think particularly, if I'm going to be kind to the American church, To those of us who consider ourselves Christians, let me just clarify something. A person who considers themselves to be a Christian and an actual follower of Jesus are not necessarily the same thing. And here's what I mean by that. Followers of Jesus follow Jesus because Jesus is worth following. And they actually see the nearness of the kingdom as they experience the nearness of the King. For a follower of Jesus, Jesus is their leader. He's their leader in their marriage. He's their leader in their family. He's their leader at work. He's their leader at play. Everywhere they exist, every touch point in every area of their life, they are committed to following Jesus. A person who claims to be a Christian may not necessarily have that same approach. You can pray a prayer and say that you put your faith and trust in Jesus, but if you're actually not following Jesus, there could be some grounds to question that. Because followers of Jesus follow Jesus because Jesus is worth following. I remember I had a pastor friend of mine back in Pennsylvania. He had a really good ability to be tactful in certain moments. And so we were in northeastern Pennsylvania where most of the people were from New York. And so it was just a direct area. There was free flowing of thoughts. Nobody was ever like, you didn't really walk around people's feelings, just everybody was direct. So I grew to love it, but I was petrified by it for many years. And I remember, so we would get regular suggestions about things that we needed to do at the church. And we were a decently sized church. And he was a super nice guy who really didn't like to offend people. So he developed this wonderful way of telling someone, yeah, that's a terrible idea, we're not going to do that, without actually saying, yeah, that's a terrible idea, we're not going to do that. And so he would say the following statement. He would say, I will take that under advisement. And he would say it with a smile on his face and a real warmth, that everyone would walk away going, oh yeah, he's going to do what I just did. And the rest of us realized that in that moment that he was telling them, yeah, that's a terrible idea. We're not going to do that, but I'm going to smile at you and it's going to be fine, right? And so as I think about that, I think, sometimes that's the difference between a follower of Jesus and a person who claims to be a Christian. As a person who claims to be a Christian, they look at Jesus and his commands and his counsel and go, yeah, I'm going to take that under advisement. Which means, yeah, I'm not interested in that. I'm not going to do that. But a follower of Jesus is all in. And they say, wherever, Jesus, you're going to take us, that's where I'm going to go. That's what I'm going to do. Even if it's not my first choice, it's the best choice. A follower of Jesus follows Jesus because Jesus is worth following. And in doing so, they help other followers of Jesus become followers of Jesus and follow Jesus themselves and experience a little bit of the nearness of the kingdom that exists within them. So the next time that you see a student or an adult imitating their favorite sports player, whoever that may be, I guess that could be LeBron James today for everybody, Caitlin Clark, whatever that looks like. I want that to remind you that following Jesus is a key to experiencing the nearness of the kingdom and that God is intentionally pursuing each one of us to follow him in that way, shape, and form.